The airport was buzzing with activity. Passengers shuffled through security lines, announcements echoed overhead, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of jet fuel. In the middle of the chaos stood Barron Trump, his tall frame leaning casually against a column near the boarding gates. His black hoodie was pulled over his head, casting a shadow over his calm yet observant face. He looked like any ordinary teenager trying to blend in, but the occasional glances and hushed whispers from nearby passengers said otherwise. "Isn't that Barron Trump?" a woman murmured, clutching her coffee cup a little tighter. Her companion stole a glance, but quickly looked away, as if afraid to confirm her suspicion. Barron shifted his weight and glanced at the digital clock above the departure screen. It was 5 minutes past his boarding time, and there had been no announcement for his gate. He sighed quietly, pulling his phone out to check his email for updates. Just as he was scrolling through, a firm voice interrupted him. "Young man, this area is restricted," a sharp voice said. Barron looked up to see a woman in a crisp airport uniform standing in front of him, her arms crossed and an air of authority about her. She didn't wait for him to respond. "You can't stand here without proper authorization. Where's your boarding pass?" Barron blinked, caught off guard by her tone. "I have it right here," he said, pulling the folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to her with calm precision, but the woman barely glanced at it before shoving it back toward him. "This doesn't look real," she said dismissively, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby travelers. "You need to leave this area immediately." Barron's expression didn't change, but his grip on the boarding pass tightened slightly. "It's valid," he said, his tone measured. "I think there's been a mistake." The woman's eyes narrowed as she studied him, her skepticism deepening. "Don't argue with me. If you don't leave now, I'll have security escort you out." A few people nearby started whispering, their curiosity growing. One man pulled out his phone, subtly aiming it in Barron's direction. "What's going on?" someone asked. "Is he causing trouble?" Before Barron could say anything else, 2 security guards appeared. Their demeanor was as stern as the woman's. Without giving Barron a chance to explain, they flanked him and began leading him toward the exit. The whispers around them grew louder, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. As the automated doors slid open and Barron stepped outside, he felt a pang of frustration, not for himself, but for the assumptions people seemed so quick to make. He glanced over his shoulder one last time at the chaotic scene inside the terminal, then turned away, unsure of what would happen next. That's when the sound of sharp heels clicking against the polished floor echoed through the lounge. The air seemed to shift as heads turned in unison. There she was, Melania Trump. Her presence commanded instant attention. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes scanned the room with laser focus. It didn't take her long to spot Barron just beyond the doors, his figure silhouetted against the sunlight streaming in. She strode forward with purpose, the crowd parting like waves in her wake. As she reached the doors, they slid open again, and she stood face to face with the flustered staff who had just thrown her son out. "Can someone explain why my son is standing outside instead of boarding his flight?" she asked, her voice calm yet laced with steel. The staff member who had confronted Barron froze, her confidence visibly wavering under Melania's piercing gaze. She stammered, "Ma'am, I didn't realize. There must have been a misunderstanding." Melania raised an eyebrow, her posture unyielding. "A misunderstanding? You accuse my son of lying and had him escorted out. That doesn't sound like a misunderstanding to me." The security guards shifted uncomfortably, their earlier assertiveness now replaced with nervous glances at each other. One of them tried to step in. "We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Melania interrupted, her voice as cold as ice. "Is humiliating someone part of your protocol? Is treating a teenager like a criminal your standard procedure?" The crowd that had gathered earlier to watch Barron's ejection now watched in complete silence. The energy in the room was tense, electrified by the unexpected confrontation. Barron, still standing just outside the glass doors, hesitated before stepping back into the terminal. He met his mother's eyes briefly and spoke softly. "Mom, it's fine. Let's just leave." But Melania didn't move. Her sharp gaze locked onto the staff member who had dismissed Barron. "No, Barron," she said firmly. "This isn't fine. Today, it's you. Tomorrow, it could be someone else who doesn't have a voice to defend themselves." The staff member's face turned pale. She fumbled for words but couldn't find any. Melania extended her hand. "Let me see the boarding pass you claimed was fake." The woman hesitated, then retrieved the crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and handed it over. Melania unfolded it slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the details. A faint smirk tugged at her lips, but her tone was lethal as she held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said, her voice echoing through the silent lounge, "is a valid first-class boarding pass. Not fake." Valid gasps rippled through the onlookers, and a few began murmuring under their breath. The staff member's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. One of the security guards stepped forward. "Ma'am, Enough!" Melania cut him off, her voice razor-sharp. "You've embarrassed my son, insulted him, and dismissed him based on nothing but your assumptions. Who gave you the authority to treat anyone this way?" Before anyone could respond, Barron spoke again, his voice calm yet firm. "Mom, it's okay. Let's just go." But Melania shook her head. "Not yet." She turned to the staff member, who now looked like she wished the ground would swallow her whole. "I want to speak to your manager, now." At that moment, a senior airport official arrived, alerted by the commotion. He approached with hurried steps, his face a mixture of panic and forced politeness. "Mrs. Trump, I deeply apologize for this incident. Please allow me to—" "You can't undo what's already done," Melania interrupted. "But you can ensure this never happens again. Start by explaining how your staff is trained to handle passengers." The official opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Barron's attention shifted to a young employee standing nervously in the corner. Unlike the others, this boy, barely out of his teens, looked genuinely uncomfortable with the situation. Barron had noticed him earlier, trying to step forward during the confrontation, but silenced by his superior. "You," Barron called out, his tone softer but resolute. The young employee's eyes widened as all attention turned to him. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his supervisor, who gave him a warning look, but Melania's gaze softened slightly as she spoke. "It's okay. You can speak freely." The boy swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. "My name is Jake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron nodded. "Jake, you saw what happened earlier, didn't you?" Jake looked down, shifting uncomfortably. I did. I tried to say something, but—" He trailed off, glancing nervously at his superior. "Speak," Melania urged, her voice steady but encouraging. "No one will silence you now." Jake took a deep breath. "I saw his boarding pass, and it looked fine to me. But my supervisor told me to stay quiet and let security handle it. I'm really sorry. I should have spoken up louder." The room fell silent again as Jake's words hung in the air. Melania turned her sharp gaze toward the supervisor, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. "Is this true?" she demanded. The supervisor stammered, I thought it was best to follow procedure. We didn't want to take any risks." "Risks?" Barron repeated, his voice cutting through the tension. "Do you always assume the worst about people who don't fit your expectations?" Jake's face turned red with shame, but Barron stepped closer to him and said, "You didn't have to do what you did, Jake. You tried, and that means something." He turned back to his mother. "Mum, I think Jake deserves a chance to say what he couldn't earlier." Melania nodded. her expression softening. "Go ahead, Jake. Tell us, what should have been done differently?" Jake hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting nervously toward the supervisor again. But when he looked back at Barron and Melania, something in their steady, expectant gazes gave him the courage to speak. "I think," Jake began, his voice trembling slightly, "we need better training. We're told to follow strict rules. But sometimes those rules make us forget that we're dealing with real people, not just policies. If we'd taken a second to actually listen, or even just double-check his pass, none of this would have happened." The lounge grew eerily quiet as Jake's words settled over the room. Melania nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Respect and understanding should always come first," she said. "Policies are important, but when you forget the human side of things, mistakes like this become inevitable." Barron smiled faintly, his eyes meeting Jake's. "Thanks for being brave enough to say that." The senior airport official stepped forward, seizing the opportunity to regain control of the situation. "Jake, you've made a valid point," he said, his tone suddenly more measured. "We'll take this incident as a learning moment. I'll personally review our procedures and ensure our staff receives better training." Melania gave him a sharp look. "That's a start, but I want to see real changes, not just empty promises." As the official nodded hurriedly, Barron's attention was drawn back to the supervisor, whose discomfort had now turned into something closer to guilt. Barron studied him quietly for a moment before speaking. "Why did you treat me the way you did?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. "What made you assume I didn't belong here?" The supervisor opened his mouth to reply but faltered, his gaze dropping to the floor. I thought you were just another spoiled kid trying to make trouble," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I've seen so many people use their status to get away with things. I guess I assumed you were the same." Barron tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You judged me without even knowing me," he said. "Do you do that with everyone? Or just people who don't look the way you expect them to?" The man flinched at Barron's words, his shoulders slumping further. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I made a mistake, and I need to do better." Before Melania could respond, Barron stepped forward, surprising everyone. He extended a hand toward the supervisor, his gesture simple but profound. "Apologizing takes courage," he said. "Just make sure you learn from this." The supervisor stared at Barron's hand for a moment, as if unsure whether he deserved the gesture. Then, with a shaky breath, he reached out and shook it. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The tension in the room seemed to lift slightly, though the weight of the incident still lingered. As the supervisor stepped back, the senior official cleared his throat. "Mrs. Trump, Barron," he began, his tone deferential, "as an apology for everything that's happened, we've upgraded your flight to a private cabin, and, if it's all right with you, we'd like to invite Barron to speak to our staff during a training session about respect and communication." Barron blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the request. He glanced at his mother, who offered him an encouraging smile. "What do you think, Barron?" she asked softly. He thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll do it," he said. "But not just for the staff, for everyone who's ever been treated the way I was today." The crowd, still lingering nearby, broke into quiet applause. Melania placed a hand on Barron's shoulder, her voice low and full of pride. "Let's go, Barron," she said. "It's time to board." As they walked toward the gate, the crowd parted to let them through. Barron glanced back one last time at Jake, who offered him a small, shy wave. For the first time that day, Barron smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that hinted at something deeper. But just as they approached the gate, Melania's phone buzzed in her purse. She stopped, pulling it out and glancing at the screen. Her expression shifted from calm to concerned in an instant. Without a word, she handed the phone to Barron. He took it, his brow furrowing as he read the message displayed on the screen. It was short, just a few words, but they sent a chill down his spine. "We know where you are. Leave now, or there will be consequences." Barron's heart pounded as he looked up at his mother. "Mom," he whispered, his voice low but urgent, "who sent this?" Melania's expression didn't betray much, but her voice was tight. "I don't know," she said, "but we're not taking any chances." The senior official, who had been walking ahead of them, noticed their hesitation and turned back. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Melania handed him the phone, her lips pressed into a thin line. His face darkened as he read the message. "I'll alert security immediately," he said, pulling out his walkie-talkie. "Wait," Barron interjected, his voice steady despite the tension. "If we make a scene, whoever sent this will know they've rattled us. We need to handle this carefully." Melania gave him a sharp look, her protective instincts clearly at odds with his suggestion. "Barron, this isn't a game," she said firmly. "If there's a threat, we can't ignore it." "I'm not ignoring it," Barron replied, his voice unwavering. "But if we panic, we give them exactly what they want." The official hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll escort you to the gate discreetly," he said. "I'll have plainclothes security follow you on board." As they moved through the terminal toward the private gate, Barron couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that eyes were on him. His gaze swept across the bustling lounge, searching for anything or anyone out of place. The energy in the air had shifted. It wasn't just tension. It was the kind of foreboding that made his chest tighten. Melania walked beside him, her steps steady but her posture unusually stiff. Though her expression remained composed, Barron could tell she was on edge. Every so often she'd glance back, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd for threats. When they finally reached the gate, the private jet waited for them on the tarmac. A flight attendant greeted them warmly at the bottom of the steps, her bright smile completely unaware of the tension surrounding the situation. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Trump." "Mr. Trump," she said, stepping aside to let them ascend. Inside the plane, the cabin was pristine, luxurious, and eerily quiet. The hum of the engines filled the space as Melania took her seat, gesturing for Barron to sit across from her. Once the doors closed and the jet began to taxi, she leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her tone softer now, almost motherly. "I'm fine," Barron said, though the slight tremor in his hands betrayed him. He clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself. "But whoever sent that message, they wanted to scare us. We can't let them win." Melania sighed, placing a hand on his knee. "Bravery is important, Barron, but so is caution. We'll figure this out together." Barron nodded, his eyes drifting toward the window as the jet picked up speed. He stared at the runway lights, his mind replaying the events of the day. The way the staff had treated him, the threatening message, the sense that this wasn't over. Just as he began to relax, the plane lurched abruptly, throwing him forward in his seat. Melania gripped the armrests, her eyes darting toward the cockpit. "What's happening?" she asked the flight attendant, who rushed down the aisle, her face pale. "The pilot reported a technical issue," the attendant said nervously. "He's investigating it now." Barron exchanged a glance with his mother. The unease that had been gnawing at him all day surged back in full force. "Mum," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. "What if this isn't just a coincidence?" Before she could respond, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unexpected issue. Please remain seated while we investigate." Melania's eyes narrowed. She reached for her phone but paused, as if considering something. "Barron," she said firmly, "stay where you are." Don't move until I say. Barron nodded, though his instincts told him something was very wrong. He shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the cabin. Then, just above the hum of the engines, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic beeping sound. It was so soft that at first he thought he was imagining it. But it was there. "Do you hear that?" Barron asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Melania looked up, alarmed. "What?" she asked. "A beeping sound," he said, standing despite her earlier warning. He followed the sound, his steps slow and deliberate, until he reached an overhead compartment just a few rows away. The beeping grew louder. "Barron, wait!" Melania called, her voice sharper now. "Let the crew handle it." But Barron had already opened the compartment. Inside was a small, unfamiliar device with a blinking red light. He froze, staring at it. The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face pale as he spotted the device. "Everyone stay back!" he barked, rushing toward Barron. He carefully inspected the device before speaking again. "It's a time disruption device," he said grimly. "Not a bomb, but enough to disable our systems mid-flight." Melania's hand flew to her mouth, her composure slipping for the first time. "Who would do this?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and anger. Barron's jaw tightened. "Someone who wants to do more than just scare us," he said. "They're sending a message." The senior airport official from earlier burst into the cabin, flanked by airport security. "We've detained a suspect," he announced. "An employee was caught acting suspiciously near the tarmac." Melania's eyes narrowed. "Who is it?" she demanded. The official hesitated, his face clouded with uncertainty. "We're still investigating, but it seems to be someone with a personal grudge against your family. They're being interrogated as we speak." Barron's mind raced, piecing together the events of the day. The biased treatment, the cryptic message, the planted device, everything pointed to a deliberate, calculated attack. "I want to talk to them," Barron said suddenly, his voice steady despite the chaos. Melania's head snapped toward him. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "This is dangerous enough already." "Mum," Barron said, his tone softening, "I need to understand why. If we don't face this now, it'll just keep happening." Melania hesitated, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes clashing with the determination in his. After a long pause, she exhaled deeply. "All right," she said reluctantly, "but I'm coming with you." The interrogation room was cold and unwelcoming, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the pale walls. Barron entered with his mother close behind, her hand lightly resting on his shoulder. Across the table sat a man in his early 50s, his graying hair disheveled and his expression a mix of defiance and exhaustion. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing when they fell on Barron. "You got to be kidding me," the man scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "They sent a kid to talk to me?" Barron didn't flinch. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle the man more than any outburst could have. "Why did you do it?" Barron asked, his voice steady. The man sneered. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Barron replied, taking a seat across from him. Melania stood behind him, silent but watchful. The man chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "People like you think you're untouchable. You've never had to struggle, never had to fight for anything in your life. Everything's just handed to you on a silver platter. I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose control, even for a moment." Barron leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "And putting everyone on that plane in danger, that's how you wanted to make your point?" he asked. "By risking innocent lives?" The man's defiance faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a scowl. "Innocent lives? Don't talk to me about innocence. Your family represents everything that's wrong with this world. Power, privilege. People like me get stepped on every day while people like you keep climbing higher." Barron sat back, letting the man's words sink in. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a small nod, encouraging him to continue. Turning back to the man, Barron said quietly, "You think hurting people will fix what's broken in your life? All you've done is prove that you're no better than the people you hate." The man's bravado cracked slightly, his gaze dropping to the table. Barron continued, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know your story, and maybe I never will, but what you did today, it wasn't about justice. It was about anger. And anger like that doesn't solve anything. It just creates more problems." The room fell silent. The weight of Barron's words seemed to press down on the man, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Finally he muttered, "What would you know about struggle? You've never had to fight for anything." Barron hesitated for a moment before replying, his tone softer now. "You're right. I haven't had to fight for survival like some people, but that doesn't mean I don't understand what it feels like to be judged, to be misunderstood. Every day people look at me and see a name, not a person. They make assumptions about who I am without knowing anything about me." The man looked up, startled by the honesty in Barron's voice. For the first time, his expression softened, as though he was beginning to see Barron in a different light. Melania stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You put my son in danger today. You put countless other lives in danger too. Whatever anger you feel toward our family doesn't justify what you did. But," she added, her tone shifting to one of measured control, "perhaps there's still a chance for you to make things right." The man blinked, confused. "Make things right? How?" "By cooperating," Barron said, his voice steady. "Tell us who else is involved. Tell us why you did this. Maybe it won't fix everything, but it's a start." For a long moment, the man didn't say anything. His jaw clenched as he seemed to wrestle with his thoughts. Then finally he let out a heavy sigh. "It's not just me," he admitted. There's a group. They think your family represents everything wrong with the system. They wanted to make a statement. I was just the messenger." Barron and Melania exchanged a glance. The tension in the room thickened, but there was also a sense of clarity now, a glimpse into the larger picture. "Names," Melania said firmly. "Who's involved?" The man hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll tell you, but only if you guarantee I won't be thrown under the bus." "You'll have legal counsel," Melania said sharply. "But what happens next depends on how much you cooperate." The door to the room opened, and the senior airport official stepped in, flanked by security. "We've got the details," he said quietly to Melania and Barron. "But this is bigger than we thought. We need to get you both out of here now." As they were escorted out of the room, Barron glanced back at the man one last time. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Barron thought he saw regret flicker across the man's face. Whether it was for what he'd done or what he'd become, Barron couldn't tell. Outside, the night air was crisp and cool. Barron turned to his mother. "Do you think it's over?" Melania didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "It's not over," she said finally, "but we'll face whatever comes next, together." As they climbed into the waiting car, Barron leaned back in his seat, his mind racing with everything that had unfolded. The day had started with a simple misunderstanding at the airport, but now it felt like they were caught in the middle of something far bigger, and deep down, Barron knew this was only the beginning. The car moved swiftly through the dimly lit streets, its tinted windows shielding them from the flashing cameras of reporters who had already caught wind of the commotion. Barron stared out at the city lights, his reflection superimposed over the passing scenery. His thoughts were a whirlwind, replaying everything: the airport staff's treatment, the cryptic threat, the planted device, and the man in the interrogation room. Each piece of the puzzle felt connected, but the picture was still incomplete. Melania sat beside him, her phone in her hand, scrolling through messages. Her expression was unreadable, but Barron could sense her mind, working just as intensely as his. Finally, she broke the silence. "The authorities have traced the group he mentioned. They're based out of a private network, and it's likely there are more involved." Barron looked over, his brow furrowed. "So this isn't just about us?" Melania shook her head. "Number, it's bigger. They've targeted other high-profile families before. This wasn't random. They planned this carefully." Barron's chest tightened. Then why didn't they succeed? Why plant a device that could be stopped? Why send a threat instead of acting silently? Melania considered his words for a moment, her gaze softening. "Because they wanted to send a message," she said. "Fear is their weapon. They don't need to win. They just need us to feel like we've lost control." Barron nodded slowly, the realization sinking in. "But we can't give them that," he said quietly. "We have to show them they're wrong." Melania smiled faintly, brushing a hand over his hair. "You're stronger than you know, Barron, but this isn't something you can fight alone." The car pulled up to a private estate where heightened security awaited them. Armed guards stood at every entrance, and the perimeter was lined with bright floodlights. As they stepped out, a senior security officer approached, briefing them on the additional measures being taken. Inside, the house was quiet, almost eerily so. Melania led Barron to the sitting room, where she handed him a cup of tea, the gesture motherly despite the tension lingering in the air. "You need rest," she said softly. "Tomorrow we'll regroup with the authorities and figure out our next steps." But Barron couldn't rest. Not yet. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I need to know why. Why do people hate us so much?" Melania paused, her expression thoughtful. She sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. "It's not about you, Barron," she began. "It's about what people think we represent. Power, privilege, control. They see the name and forget there's a person behind it, and sometimes that anger blinds them to the truth." Barron nodded, his gaze distant. "But what if we can change that? What if we can show them we're more than just a name?" Melania's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his. "You already did today, at the airport, with that boy Jake, and even in the interrogation room. You stood up for yourself and for others. That's how change begins, with small steps." Barron's lips pressed into a thin line as he absorbed her words. He thought about Jake, the young employee who had risked speaking up, and the man in the interrogation room consumed by bitterness, yet shaken by Barron's words. For the first time, Barron felt a flicker of purpose, a sense that he could be more than just a bystander in his own life. Before he could say anything, Melania's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening. "It's the authorities," she said, standing. "They've detained another suspect, someone higher up in the group. They believe we're closer to dismantling their operation." Barron stood, his earlier exhaustion replaced by a sense of urgency. "Can I come with you?" Melania hesitated. "It's not safe." "But I need to see this through," Barron insisted. "I can't just sit here while this happens." After a long pause, Melania relented. "All right," she said. "But you stay close to me. No risks." The drive to the secure facility was tense, neither of them speaking much. When they arrived, they were led into a high-tech command center where a group of officials was gathered around a monitor. On the screen was a live feed of the suspect, another man, younger this time, his face blank but his eyes cold. Barron and Melania listened as the authorities detailed the group's activities, a web of coordinated attacks designed to instill fear and disrupt lives. The more Barron heard, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about his family. It was about power struggles, disillusionment, and a world where anger too often replaced dialogue. As the briefing ended, one of the lead investigators turned to Barron. "Your actions today helped us uncover this network," he said. "You've done more than you realize." Barron glanced at his mother, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. I just want people to see each other for who they really are," Barron said finally. "Not for their names or their status. Just people." The investigator smiled faintly. "That's a good start." As Barron and Melania left the facility, the night felt quieter somehow. The weight of the day still lingered, but so did the sense of something new, a possibility for change. In the car ride home, Barron leaned back against the seat, his eyes heavy, but his mind clear. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't want to just react to things anymore. I want to do something that matters." Melania smiled, her hand resting on his. "You already are, Barron, and this is just the beginning." As they approached the estate, the first hints of dawn began to break over the horizon. The light spilled across the sky, painting it in hues of orange and gold. For the first time in a long while, Barron felt a sense of calm, a quiet conviction that despite the challenges ahead, he could make a difference. And as the car pulled into the driveway, Barron closed his eyes, letting the hope of a new day wash over him. Whatever came next, he was ready.